A brigadier general emerged from a jeep at a Belgian command post SD. Vit town. There were 3 behind him, not men, an aide, an operations officer, and a chauffeur. The date was December 17, 1944. The biggest German attack since, for a full day, Normandy had been on fire. Standing in the snow, the general was on the verge of being the sole element between the fall and 100,000 German soldiers off the front of the Allies. Bruce was his name. Clark C. in the American press. Nobody had ever heard of him. No one in his name was known to the German high command. Even the majority of the men he was going to. His face had never been seen by command. Within the command center, Major General Alan Jones appeared to be observing everything collapses. His 106th Th was tearing the infantry division apart to fragments. Among his 3 regiments, 2 were encircled by the Schnee Eifel ridge east of the city. Interaction with them was not working. The German armor was advancing through openings his soldiers was unable to contain. Jones stated, turning to face Clark, that he had tossed in his final chips. Clark had arrived to St. Vit in anticipation of passing through on in his approach to a standard task. Rather, he was receiving Hadasaster, CCB of the 7th. His combat command, the armored division, was still a few hours distant, stranded on roads congested by retreating, escaping people and military. He had no soldiers, no places ready, not knowledge of what was to come. However, he was aware of one thing. The Germans had already 24 hours late. They required the town right away. They had a whole the Poner army was directed towards it. What they failed to did you know who the guy standing in the command post had defeated their commanding general previously. Wagram was the name of the German offensive. Rinse. Keep an eye on Rhine. Hitler's scheme to divide the Allied forces, seize the harbor of Antwerp, and compel a compromise tranquilly. The Ardennes was the primary route, Belgium's forest. 3 armies from Germany launching an assault on a 60-mile front. The most important goal in the first 48 hours was a tiny village in Belgium where most Americans were unaware of it. Vit stood where 7 important highways converged as well as 2 railroad lines. All Germans those were necessary for the division. Moving west. Roads. In the absence of St. Vit, the offensive would become stuck behind its own traffic. The commander was General Hasse von Manto, the 5th Panzer Army, the most powerful of the Ardennes, 3 German armies. The directives were clear. St. Vit needed Toffel on the 1st day. The schedule was organized by man to FL. Himself. His top divisions would pierce the Americans' tenuously clutched lines, get around obstacles if you can, and take control of the intersection before the defense might be organized by Americans. By 6 p.m. German tanks on December 16th were meant to be passing through St. Vit traveling west. The timetable permitted no delays. Every hour was important. However, on December 17th afternoon, Manteufel's schedule had already slipping. The Americans were engaged in combat more difficult than anticipated. Traffic bottlenecks on his speed was being slowed by the small forest roads. Armor. As a general now, he had never repeatedly stood in St. Vit with 3 dudes. Bruce should have been known to Manteuffel. Clark. When did Clark's unit last have blocked his way, costing him $200? Thanks. September 1944, 3 months prior, the eastern French fields of Lorraine. Clark had been in charge of Battle Command A at Armored Division No. 4. In Certanov, the bloodiest tank battles on his opponent in the mud, the Western Front, the same man who was driving lane through the Ardennes snow. Montoil hurled wave after wave of over 2 panzers at Clark's positions weeks, brand new brigades. Hurried from Germany was instructed to halt the Americanchally advance. Clark didn't battle in the manner German leaders anticipated the situation. He declined to remain stationary while waiting for the blow. Rather, he created what he referred to as mobile defense. Little groupings of Shermans are often hopping between places for firing, showing up on one path, displacing a Panther, vanishing, resurfacing on an alternate route too far distant. Tankers from Germany reported everywhere is American armor. They were unable to determine Clark's strength, since Clark never spent enough time in one location. Tobe tallied. After it was finished, Mantle's losses were enormous. Clark suffered less losses. More than 50 Shermans. The triumphant Eric Clark became one of the most seasoned U.S. Army leaders with armor. By December 1944, he had moved to the 7th Floor Armored Division, in charge of Fighting Command B. He wasn't famous, though. He wasn't ostentatious. He did not conduct interviews. Or raise reporters. He was the nice of a general who prevailed in conflicts and allowed others people tend to grab credit, which is why his name was unknown to everyone at home. And precisely why no one in the German high. The threat was identified by command when Clark arrived to St. Vit with 3 men in a jeep. Clark was told to relocate his command of warfare via St. Vit to place yourself farther to the east. A typical road march, nothing urgent. After that, he strolled into the command position of Jones and discovered there was nothing further to the east. To the east was of German descent. Jones was shattered. His 106th line had included the infantry division. Just 5 days prior to the offensive struck. The majority of his soldiers had never heard Ashit fired with rage. 2 regiments now were surrounded, and the 3rd was just about holding. Jones informed Clark he was putting him in charge of the defense of St. Vit. Clark attempted to elucidate that his battle command, roughly 2,500 personnel in armored vehicles and tank soldiers, continued to travel north off town, snarled in heavy traffic. It didn't matter. There was nothing left for Jones to give. It was a casual handover. No written directives, no thorough briefing. Merely one general informing another about the circumstances were dire, and he now had to deal with defense. As he stepped outdoors, Clark turned to face east. In the woods, somewhere, Mantoy Falls spewer divides were getting closer. He shot a radio and 3 men. CCB wouldn't arrive until that night at the first. Perhaps not until the morning. Clark began to do what he could only do. He seized all the stray units he could locate. Engineers, staff at headquarters, stragglers from malfunctioning units, and placed them on the roads that led into the city. These forces of scratch were not going to prevent an army of pouncers, but they might purchasiers, and Clark only required hours. Late in the evening, CCB started to arrive. On December 17th, about 2,500 men, engineers, tanks, armored infantry, artillery. Against a whole Poner, it wasn't much. Army. But an army wasn't necessary for Clark. He required sufficient force to turn Mantoy full belief he had one. Clark set up his defense right now. No rest, nor reconnaissance. He arranged the units according to map study, a natural ability derived from decades of expertise in armored combat. He didn't delve deeper. That was crucial. Choice. A traditional commander would have a set defensive line in place. East of St. Vit, and instructed his soldiers to keep it. A static line, Clark knew, would recognized, pursued, and overpowered in a matter of hours. Rather, he established the same mobile defense system that had destroyed Iraq's mental tanks. Tiny armored groups stationed at strategic road intersections with directives to strike harden, then make a move. Don't ever remain in one position for as long as it takes the Germans to focus against you. Return when pressure increases, followed by a counterattack. Somewhere unexpected. Create the adversary go after ghosts. His tank crews were at work. All through the night. They discovered roads, found detours, strategies for withdrawal. By daybreak, Clark had constructed something on December 18th that appeared to be a catastrophe. On paper, awaiting the event. Two firms that make tanks, dispersed soldiers, no constant line of defense. There are gaps everywhere. However, a wall wasn't necessary for Clark. He required ashido that resembled a wall. German forces attacked Clark's on December 18th positions for the first time. Punearth, roads were knocked down by grenadiers from Theist, anticipating to dismiss whatever the Americans had left behind a thin screen. They encountered Sherman's, Clark's. Tanks exploded from hiding places, unconscious leading cars, then withdrew prior to the Germans being able to call in artillery. After half an hour, those same tanks appeared 2 miles north on a different road and struck a flanking German column. The impact was as much psychological as physical. German commanders stated American armor throughout their whole front. They were unable to recognize the limits of the force they were up against due to the lack of limits. Clark had 2 tank companies performing the tasks of a regiment. They never stopped moving, spending longer than a few minutes in conversation prior to moving. German intelligence officers attempted to interpret their ports coming in from their forward units. Here are American tanks. American, there are tanks and armored infantry blocking this road. A retaliation against that road. They came to the precise conclusion that Clark desired. Mentoel was informed by them that they encountered a sizable American armed force, even a whole corps buried in the vicinity of St. Vit. Mentoel made adjustments his plans appropriately. Rather than a swift push across a vulnerable area, Hester did planning a planned attack in opposition to what he considered a serious defense stance. He began to pull further divisions in the direction of St. Vit. The forces that were meant to be driving, they were now heading west toward the Meuse River, being diverted in order to crack Clark's Corps Phantom. Each and every Mentoel division that was redirected, wasn't endangering the rear of the Allies. Additionally, each and every he spent an hour organizing a purposeful. The hour of assault was one that the Allies employed to arrange their answer. The catastrophe on December 19th was sealed. The 106th Infantry's 2 regiments division that had been encircled on Feshn-Eifel gave up. More than 7,000 American soldiers entered German territory. Imprisonment. It was the biggest mass. American troops capitulation in Theater in Europe. Clark's flanks torpedo appear overnight. The units that were being occupying locations north of him and south were no longer there. German troops poured in through the spaces. They swirled around WWII, moving westward on both sides. Clark was an island now. His meager strength held the town and the intersection of the roads, while the German division passed by on either side. 3 sides encircled him, and his western supply route was decreasing by the hour. Any logical Clark should withdraw, according to the assessment. Outgunned and outnumbered, he was the units that were intended to be shielding his sides had either given up or destroyed. Clark remained. He repositioned his perimeter. He was drawn in his most vulnerable poses and strengthened the roadside defensive actual junction. He was unable to hold of everything, but he had enough space to keep the roads closed. Brigadier Robert Hasbrouck, the general in charge of the 8th Overall Armored Division, managed the political and logistical cooperation with the higher headquarters. The fight, which Clark led, was going to get considerably worse due of Adolf Hitler has recently discovered that the schedule was 3 days behind. He was sending his own sledgehammer to resolve the issue. The Brigade of Führerbegleit was not a standard unit. Hitler's personal, the escort formation grew into a company dispatch to the Ardennes with an armored battalion with just one objective. The person in charge of it was the same Colonel Otto Ernst Reth, officer responsible for crushing the July 20th scheme to kill Hitler by protecting Berlin for the Nazi government. Reimer was a devout Christian. His brigade was fully manned, well-equipped, and inspired. They were kept in reserve, especially in circumstances such as these. When the assault encountered a barrier that regular soldiers were unable to defeat, Bruce Clark was that barrier. Hitler was incensed because St. Vit had yet to fallen. His whole schedule was reliant on certain roadways. The Brigade of Führer Begleit was his response. Crush whatever was capturing the town and going on the attack relocating. The brigade led by Reimer joined Thietack on the outskirts of Clark in December 23. New soldiers, new tanks against a force that had been engaged in combat without take 3 days off. Clark sensed the rise under pressure right away. The interrogation attacks turned into full-scale attacks. The barrage of guns increased. His men were worn out. The ammunition was running low. Each and every casualty was unique, since no reserves were arriving. Clark now had to contend with Germany's greats left, and his power was diminishing by the hour. On the 21st of December, Clark made the judgment. That would establish the defense of St. Vit. He was unable to hold his existing perimeter. It was too big for his waning power. He signed a contract with what headquarters would subsequently refer to the fortified WWII, a defensive perimeter with an oval shape focused on the methods used in the West, Tost, Vit, shorter, tighter linear separations. Between units, less spaces between the Germans to take advantage of. Each and every roll he gave up ground when he was abandoned was unable to retract, yet each position he meant to strain his men. Thinner, Clark opted for focus over coverage. He gathered the rest of his forces into the smallest area that can be defended in. Instructed them to wait. Hasbrouck was handling the ever-challenging Connie to a higher authority. 18th Airborne Corps, commanded by General Matthew Ridgway, was now in charge over the region of St. Vit. Ridgway desired, hold on as long as you can, Clark, but was making plans for withdrawal if the situation got intolerable. Clark had no intention of withdrawing, not yet. He was considering creating the every yard is paid for by Germans. Inside his tank crews, Goose Egwer reduced to partial loads of ammunition. His infantrymen had been fighting for days in the same postures with it turning. The medical evacuation was growing unfeasible as the perimeter shrank. However, the intersection of the roads was still blocked. Manteufel's army is still cowled to utilize the 7 roads in St. Vit Togo West. Additionally, each hour that Clark held was an hour. Patton was utilizing the 3rd Army north in the direction of the German flank. Components of the cavalry 87th The Reconnaissance Squadron hosted one of the most visible portions of Clark's perimeter. The division had reached 7 officers and St. Vit about 150 males. By December 22nd, they had run out of officers. 30 guys remained fighting. There are not 30 men left. 30 molestal firing, still in line, still retaining their sector. Sergeants in charge of the former platoon, corpsmen rushing what remained. Off teams, they weren't special. Each unit, the goose egg, was being eaten. Crews on tanks battled until their vehicles were unconscious, then engaged in combat as infantry. After engineers placed mines, retrieved firearms, clerks and cooks filled in the line's gaps. Clark himself having not slept inside a structure since December 17. In his jeep for 7 nights, moving from one place to another, examining his units and making choices decided who survived and who perished. He had the option of using a command post in a warm structure. It was done by other generals. Clark wouldn't carry it out. His guys were dozing off in sub-zero frozen foxhole temperatures. He would rest in his jeep. He spent 7 nights in the same cold. Soldiers persevered. The cost in human lives was astounding. Clark's leadership suffered terrible losses over a period of 7 days. By some estimates, the number of deaths in the St. Vit sector murdered more than 2,000 men, injured and unaccounted for. However, the defense held, and each day it took place was a day.nto, became much farther behind schedule that the whole German offensive based on December 2, and all of Manteufel's remaining energy was committed, opposing the Goose Egg, armor, soldiers, and artillery in a well-planned attack at 3 different angles. Shells from Germany ripped through Clark's defenses. Poner grenadiers jammed into the openings. Tanks moved through the snow on foot. The defensive line gave way in several locations. German soldiers broke through positions that remained in place for 5 days. Clark himself transitioned between Gangard industries, rerouting his diminishing reserves. There were none reserves in any significant way. Clark was removing guys from areas that were calm and hurling them at openings in the hopes that the silent areas remained silent for a long time. Got by dusk, the eastern portion of the Goose Egg had fallen apart. German soldiers were within the boundaries. The road intersection where Clark had been for 6 days was going to be overrun. Ridgway predecessed phone call. Pull out. Clark had fulfilled all of the requirements and more. St. Vit's defense had purchased 6 crucial days. He now had tormove his remaining men before Thea Goose Egg turned into a grave. Getting away alive was the issue. May be more difficult than clinging. December 2-3 RD Clark carried out a retreat under pressure from military historians. Tolleder said to as one of the best retrogradeth war's operations. This wasn't a back off. This was a rigorous, well-planned movement carried out during the day, with 3 sides are being pressed by German forces. Clark had a systematic plan. Automobiles pulled out of the western one by one, the perimeter side, while the rear guard continuous. Fighting on the eastern side, the rear guard did more than simply keep their roles. They acted out the exercise of an entire defensive line. Machine guns dismissed from jobs that had previously been taken out. Rounds were dropped by mortars from areas that have already registered with skeleton teams. The men that remained made enough fire and roar to persuade German leaders that there was still American might. By when the Germans discovered that Clark was departing, the majority of his remaining force had glided through the slender hallway to the west. The rear guard withdrew, lastly navigating the snow to connect with the primary body. Not all men protested. A few positions in the rear guard were overrun prior to their withdrawal, although the majority of Clark's force managed to leave unharmed. Along with their cars and injured people, they reorganized behind the new defense line that was further established. Montoyle's forces behind them eventually took possession of the final American locations. To the west of St. Vit, the roads were accessible 7 days after the Germans were intended to capture the town in an afternoon. It was Christmas Eve, the following evening. In the evening of December 24th, 1944, Hasse von Mantel made contact with Hitler Sagitated in the Wolf's Den. His message was direct. He suggested canceling the Ardennes offensive in its entirety. 7 days. One general in the brigade with a 2,500-man scratch force has cost the 5 Poner army for a whole week. The schedule that the offensive relied upon was irreparably damaged as Patton seized St. Vit. Clark had attacked after turning the 3rd Army 90 degrees north. Into the southern flank of Germany. Montgomery had coordinated the northern Halder. Having dug in, the 101st Airborne refused to break at Bastogne. However, it took time to get those answers. The moment that Clark made a blood purchase, the defense of St. V did more than merely postpone one German army. It broke everyone's back. Offensive. Traffic that ought to have been flowing west was immobilized for miles. Behind the town. Manteuffel was burned, his valuable time and gasoline battling a ghost. Later, Eisenhower would refer to the defense of St. Vit, the pivotal moment in the Bulge battle, but nearly no one can recall it. The narrative of the Bulge turned into Baston's tale, the 101st Airborne, encircled and refusing to back down. McAuliffe single quotes as renowned one-word replito the call for German surrender. Bastogne was an attack that provided support. The Germans didn't need it, but wanted it. Vit was the primary endeavor. To hold the assault relied on those roots. Clark held the primary assault for 7 days, and his name was unknown. McAuliffe stated one phrase, and you were immortal. In 1965. Over 2 decades following the conflict, 2 documentary crews brought retired generals in Watertown, New York. Hasso Fahn and Bruce Clark Mono, the individual who stood up for St. Vit, us man who attempted to accept it. Previous adversaries who are now citizens of the Allies. Montoya told Clark after glancing at him something that had been unknown for 2 decades. German intelligence had thought they were engaged in combat for entire corps of Americans at St. Vit. Not a battle command, a corps, not 2,500 men. Clark's 2 tank companies had deceived everyone, the 5th Polar Army. Manteuffel informed Clark that St. Vit's defense had ruined the German scheme. Not postponed, spoiled it. Because of this, the entire offensive failed. 1 general with very minimal resource. Medial battled for a town he was meant to enjoy an afternoon. Clark paid attention. Silently. By then he was 63 years old. Retired. Not well known or famous person. He never conducted interviews that promoted himself. Following the war, never penned abyss-selling autobiography, never showed up on television to get credit. The most noisy the Bulge story's voices belonged to Montgomery and McAuliffe. Clark just did the work and left for home. His guys were aware of took place at St. Vit. The 87th Recon survivors were aware. The tank driver stows highways for 7 days. In a row. Was aware. Manteuffel was aware. It required the adversary, to the commander was seated across the table, 20 years later, to at last verify what Clark had succeeded.